Welcome, everybody. We have a special edition of Digital Media Wire's webinar series today, and I'll introduce that session in just a moment. But as a reminder, folks, we have our chat open, and we certainly welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat. When you do so, please make sure to select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down so that we can, everybody can see your introductions. We also invite you to drop in your LinkedIn if you'd like, or a little blurb about yourself and what you're working on. Also, if you have questions for our panelists today, please put them in the Q&A. As you can see, the Q&A is just to the left of the chat, and those will go straight to our panel today. As I mentioned, we have a very special program today. We're going to be talking about the intersection of government, community, technology, and entertainment. Today on the show, we have a good friend of mine and longtime friend and colleague, Chris Misner, former executive at Roblox and Apple, and he'll be joined by progressive leaders Holly Mitchell and Khanna. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much, Ned, and appreciate the intro, and I've enjoyed so many of these lunches. It's great to be actually hosting and moderating one. It's 11 days until the election and the voting stops because people are voting now. So it seems appropriate to talk politics today before the weekend. The presidential race may come up. People want to talk about that, but that's not the focus here. The focus here is a lively conversation with two of California's most interesting and innovative public officials. We want to talk about how policy innovation happens. I want to talk about what it means to create an economy that works for everyone, and also engage with you on how leaders in the digital economy can become more involved in our civic affairs. So our two guests will come from, one from Northern California and one from the LA area, our two digital hubs. I have to say that Khanna is delayed right now on the House floor with a vote on a stimulus package. So he's going to join us in the middle of this as soon as he can get off the floor. That's one of his jobs working for us. But we're going to start the conversation with Holly Mitchell. Holly, do you want to put your video on so everyone can see you? Terrific. Hey, Holly. So we're honored to have Holly Mitchell here. She's currently a state senator and chair of the Budget Committee, which oversees all the finances for the state. And this is, of course, the 5th largest economy in the world, so that's a big deal. And prior to jumping into the politics 10 years ago, she's not a lifelong politician by any means. She was CEO of Crystal Stairs. And that's an award-winning nonprofit that helps children's health and parental health. And it's the largest in the state. She's also currently a candidate for the LA County Supervisor. So welcome, Holly. Great to have you here.
Chris, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
All right, terrific. Well, look, I want to start with the term progressive because that's bandied around a lot. That's not one that you use to describe yourself so often, but it's one that people describe you as progressive a lot. Like it's not a headline when on your website or when you talk. Tell us a little bit about what that word means to you and how do you characterize your approach to policy in general?
I appreciate that. And let me say, hearing the update from you that Congressman Khanna is on the floor voting on a stimulus package was music to my Senate budget chair ears. We balanced our budget this year with the expectation that the feds would come in with some additional support. And October 15th, we had to activate some trigger cuts. So the sooner they get to work and bring some bacon home, go get it, Representative Khanna, I need it. So that was really good to hear. You know, that's interesting. It's not a term I shy away from at all. I think when people ask me, I refer to myself as a progressive Democrat. Certainly given the uptick in the presence of moderate Dems in the California state legislature. And so I think, you know, other than that relatively new phenomenon, I probably wouldn't describe myself as a progressive Democrat, but certainly 5 minutes on my website or 10 minutes with me, everyone would be clear that that's what I am. Sure. It's not a term I shy away from, you know, like some of the young feminists I know tend to shy away from that term. It's not a term I shy away from, but again, it's one that I wouldn't automatically have used.
Like, what does it mean to be progressive? And because one of the things you're known for through your work in the state is that you're very data driven on the one hand,
Yes, yes.
but you're also very community led, right? You really
Yes.
engage the community to source solutions to problems. So, you know, maybe just tell us a little bit about sort of how those two things come together. And if I could prompt you on one example, you know, you most recently authored the tax credit for film and TV in California, right? That's a big $330 million to support industry. Tell me what the data side of you thinks about that, and tell me what the community side of you know, how those two things come together when you think about it.
And it's interesting when I think about using the data and following community, rarely are they on opposite sides, quite frankly. I think the community understands and looks to data to justify their position. So I've never been in a position where the community was pushing for one thing and data suggested something else, particularly in the criminal justice and juvenile justice right sizing realm, which I spent a lot of legislative time in. You know, with regard to the film tax credit, I was proud to author a film tax credit, I think 3.0. I think this is our third iteration.
Yeah.
And the data was evident. I wouldn't necessarily call that a, you know, an example of progressive politics. For me, it was logical. It was absolutely business friendly. You know, it was a shock to me when I got elected 10 years ago to realize that, you know, that industry was really hemorrhaging. California was hemorrhaging. And the entertainment industry, and specifically the studios, several of the large studios, are the largest employer in my Senate district. So it made sense that I would gravitate toward that area. But again, it was looking at the data, recognizing our loss of jobs, loss of revenue to the state. When we took a step back under Schwarzenegger, unfortunately, and let states like Georgia and New Mexico step up with tax credits. I had an exec at Sony literally tell me one day that the governor from New Mexico showed up at the studio with a physical checkbook. Like, what do you need to bring production to my state? And so I knew that it was something that we had ignored. We took a big hit financially as a result. So I was proud to make that transition. And every iteration of the film tax credit has improved upon the prior. We've expanded the tax credit, not to the degree that like my mayor of LA would want to compete with Georgia to take it up to 550 million. We're not there yet. But this version, we added some expectations around diversity for employment for behind the lens. And so, you know, it's about jobs. It's about supporting small businesses and those who support people in front of the camera.
And how do you choose the number? Why is it 330 and not 550?
That really is about negotiation, because quite frankly, when you give tax credits, you know, some interpret that as less income coming into the general fund. And so it really was a negotiation primarily with the previous administration. This Governor Newsom was much more open to the concept, and we had to collect that data. And the Film Commission has done an amazing job in reporting what every dollar in the tax incentive, the tax credit, has yielded us in terms of jobs, the number of productions that have returned to California. We expanded it beyond film to include television. And so they've done a great job. They make my job easy in laying out the data and showing us how many jobs we've saved, what kind of revenue we brought back into the state.
What other areas do you think about that are ripe for policy innovation? And maybe, you know, I know you've spent a lot of time on a lot of different areas. You mentioned criminal justice reform. There's homelessness, I know, is one of your big issues, but I think people don't necessarily think of those as areas for quote unquote innovation. But tell me how you see that, and some of the innovations that you see are very logical and possible.
Well, health is the perfect example. I think through COVID, we have expanded the use of telehealth, primarily in our publicly funded health systems, an area that the government didn't always reimburse at a reasonable rate, but because of COVID, we have, and it's just exploded. The access to healthcare services has increased significantly. I've heard from, you know, providers like Planned Parenthood or the Community Clinic Association, who talk about, given the population they serve, California residents who struggle with access to reliable transportation, who struggle with getting off work to be able to make it to a doctor's visit, who struggle with, if I've got 3 kids at home, how do I take one sick kid to the doctor, not bring the other 2 with me? And so through telehealth, it's been amazing for physical health and mental health services. It's just opened up the doors to allow people to access their healthcare provider from their home, from wherever they are, in a meaningful way. I think innovation, we also have to recognize that we have all now become completely reliant on this technology. And when I think about LAUSD and the struggles we had in getting kids in the online learning, given the number of LAUSD students who either didn't have devices or reliable internet, innovation must continue in our effort to make sure that there's educational equity across the state of California, not just the kids whose parents had the resources to make sure they had a device just for them, high-speed internet, the teaching pods that many communities have devised. So I think innovation is going to be our way to make sure that every child, regardless of what zip code you were born into or your mother's educational achievement, will have access and will not fall further behind in their educational
achievement. And do you feel like that
achievement.
is something that, as whether it's as a county supervisor or the state Senate, are you able to affect to bridge those equity gaps around technology for those communities? Or do you think it's really working with the federal government? Who is in the driver's seat and who's the funder for all this stuff?
That's a great question, and it's all of us. So for example, federal government comes into play because they've not done underground cabling in housing developments, also known as projects. Mm-hmm. And so the working families who are struggling, who live in public housing developments, don't have access. So, you'll drive by Jordan Downs or Nickerson Gardens in South LA, and you see everybody's got a dish and all these external, because they don't have underground cabling. So the federal government needs to do a better job. As we go to 5G, we've got to make sure that we really close this digital divide once and for all. The state, and Public Utilities Commission, we have a role to play as well in terms of expressing our expectations. Municipal government, local governments, there are cities in California that have made the internet free and accessible to everyone. So literally every level of government, if you will, has a significant role to play.
Absolutely, good. And I think that's one of those areas that's interesting because, the digital divide exists in highly urban areas, but it also exists in rural areas. There's like 20 million kids out there in rural America who have no internet either. So, there's coalitions that are interesting that potentially can help resolve some of these at the federal level.
I completely agree. And that's where telehealth came into play too, because it's also rural areas have a challenge in terms of their access to healthcare providers. So telehealth was the answer for those communities if indeed they had access to the internet. So you're absolutely right.
Let's talk about, you've got a very detailed plan on homelessness. There's lots of plans out there, around how to get broadband to everybody. It seems like we have no shortage of ideas. Tell me, as somebody who's in the guts of our political system, which I am not, what's really stopping us from solving these problems? Is it money? Is it the way our politics are organized? Is it something else? What do you like? What keeps you going every day to solve these problems, which are been with us for a while and aren't going away soon? But it seems like there are solutions, but we just can't get them done. What's your point of view on that?
So, I wish there were a simple answer. There really isn't, because it depends on the issue. Sometimes it's lack of political will, around housing and affordable housing. Housing policies are complex and have difficult histories around race and class. And from my perspective, the issue around housing is what gets built for whom and where. And so when I think about areas of my district that are beautiful and historic and are zoned as single family houses, while they want to talk about affordability and expansion and density, not in my pristine community. So some of it is about, you know, political will and the courage to push forward for the greater good. Sometimes it is resources. Here in Los Angeles County, we are 500,000 housing units shy of what we need for the population. Conservatively speaking, we have 70,000 LA County residents who are unhoused, unsheltered, literally on the streets every night. And the voters voted to tax themselves, Measures H and HHH, a couple of years ago. The challenge with that is the amount of time it takes to build a unit. And so voters then get frustrated. They said, look, I put the money up and there's still tent encampments on my block. And so I think it's not just one issue. Sometimes it's political will, sometimes it's resources, sometimes it's placement. It's all of those things that complicate matters.
Got it. Hey, one of the quotes I like from you is that you, when you were working, I think at Crystal Stairs and a few other times, you said, as goes California, so goes the US, right? That's
absolutely.
Where do you see California leading right now in terms of policy? Where, you know, we created the greatest public university system, you know, we created this technology boom. There's so many amazing things that come from California, but from where you sit, what sort of policy innovations is California leading on that you'd like, that you think the rest of the country will follow?
Well, I think, you know, California has, you know, we're a two-faced state. There are areas where we have led that have been for the greater good. I think what we've done around criminal justice reform and juvenile justice reform, you know, Congress looks to us in terms of what can come next. Many states look to us in terms of what can come next. In climate change, you know, we were at the last, you know, Paris Accord and won awards competing with other nations because of what we've been able to do in terms of acknowledging climate change and making very aggressive, progressive policies to clean our air, clean our water, to reduce particulate matter in our air. I think those are great strides we have made. You know, there are other areas where we've fallen short. We led the nation in the whole concept of term limits. We led the nation in the tax revolt. There's an amazing documentary I just saw that chronicles the history of Prop 13 in California and what fed into it and how it then took off all across the country. So, you know, California has two sides to her face. There are areas where through our innovation, we have led in a positive light. And there are areas where we've led the country down the primrose path.
All right. Well, I want to switch now to talk a little bit more about the process of being a public servant and for running for office and some of the tools and things you use. One of the things, you're very active on Twitter. And I want to talk, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you use it and how much weight you give it. So just tell me about sort of how it works into your life in terms of how you're engaging with colleagues and constituents, et cetera.
Well, I know one of the questions you all posed in preparation for today's experience was, what is the biggest innovation you think that has impacted, you know, policy making? And it would have to be, in my humble opinion, social media. Everyone from the president, you know, on down engages with voters, shares opinion, and, you know, however many, you know, letters Twitter now allows us. So social media has played a significant role. It's expanded my ability to communicate with constituents in real time. It's cost savings, you know, between, you know, gone are the days where we get huge mail budgets, where we send, you know, quarterly newsletters. We mail quarterly newsletters home. I partnered recently on a town hall with Congresswoman Nanette Barragan. She still had a pretty sizable budget and was able to mail to our shared constituency. And it was interesting because it was a town hall to talk about a policy shift we've put in place for low-income seniors, where we've expanded their ability to access food stamps. So I use our email list, and we had maybe 20 respondents. After the Congresswoman did her snail mail announcement to that unique population, we had 300 people in the room. So even though social media it is innovative and has expanded our ability to reach constituents, it's perhaps expanded our ability to reach a particular segment of our constituency. So it really is important that we think about a balance.
And even within the younger population that's more engaged with social media, do you find that it's representative of how your district is feeling, or is it sort of the the cranky person who shows up at the town meeting? Which does it end up being, or is it both?
It's both. It's hard to tell. It's because what do I have to compare it to? The reality is when we do a teletown hall, either via phone or computer, I get 20 times the turnout than I would at a Saturday morning, come to your local library to hear from your state senator. We just do. I've always done budget town hall since I first got elected, and we would get the biggest turnout in the tough budget years when we were proposing cuts, again, from a segment of the population, those who were going to be impacted by those cuts. Now we do them. I did a town hall in EDD, and I think we blew up Zoom. So more people are showing up, which is a great thing. To figure out if it's representative of the overall sentiment of a district of 1 million people, that's hard to gauge. I'm just glad they're showing up. There was a town hall not too long ago about a rather controversial housing density bill. And I asked the people, this is before COVID, I asked the people in the room, I'd been their representative in either the Assembly or Senate for 10 years, how many of them had come to a town hall or met me before? And only a quarter of the hands in the room went up. I said, well, it's a good thing for this controversial bill. It's nice to meet you all. So, it depends on what motivates people to show up, either in person or through technology. And typically it's if a bill or some action I'm going to take impacts them directly personally. That's when people will show up.
Yeah. Great. Well, look, just for those of you who are just tuning in, we are expecting, we're delighted to be talking with Holly Mitchell about issues that are facing the industry in California. Khanna is delayed on a floor vote for a COVID stimulus bill, so we're expecting him, in the next 10 minutes or so, we've been told. A couple of questions have just popped in. I want to run some of those by you. So the first is really, the California legislature has dealt a lot with privacy, internet privacy. And so I'm going to just take one piece of this question, which is, what's your view in terms of California's ability to protect intellectual property that's made here, number one, but also, how do you think people think about privacy, and is California ahead or behind on that?
I think we're behind, quite frankly. I think, government, government rarely innovates. We respond, and our job should be to get out of the way of innovation, to not block innovation. But we typically are responsive, and government is typically slow. I think that was one of the most frustrating things that led me to run for office, and continues to be an issue that frustrates me as a policymaker. And I think privacy is, and technology has gotten ahead of us, to be perfectly frank. We see it in our inability oftentimes to stand up technology to run our own government systems. We have invested, lots of money in lots of failed systems because they were too big, whatever the case may be. Even making sure that state government has a department of technology that has the internal expertise to help guide our decisions, just, as an employer and as a service provider. And so we really have been kind of behind the 8 ball in trying to make sure that we are ahead of innovation, both positive and negative, to protect privacy. It's coming up currently with regard to the protection of our voting systems. I think our Secretary of State has been vigilant in making sure that every registered voter and voter in California feels confident that using all of these varied systems, be it mail-in or here in LA County with our new electronic voting machines, that your privacy is indeed protected. So there have been any number of pieces of legislation, select committees, standing committees that have really attempted to address this issue. But no, I do think that we're behind.
Got it. We've had a few questions about propositions that have just hit the screen. That's a very complicated space, of course.
It is.
And rather than peeling off one or two, is there one that you think that you're paying particular attention to that you think is super important?
Well, selfishly, yes, I'll have to say. And it's Prop 15. I mentioned earlier this amazing documentary, The First Angry Man, I think is the title. Talks about, the culture and the climate in which Prop 13 came to be. And from my perspective as a budget chair, looking at all of the areas of that we have strangled.
Just to remind people, is the property tax, revolution that happened in the 70s.
Exactly.
That keeps everybody who owns homes keeps their taxes right where they were when they bought the house.
Precisely.
Sorry, keep going.
And so there's a proposition that attempts to address the corporate side of Prop 13, because I wasn't voting age in 78 when Prop 13 passed, but I remember clearly the dinner table conversations my parents had. I also remember feeling and experiencing the impact of the passage of Prop 13. When my local library had reduced hours, when you would ask your school teacher for extra supplies, oh, Prop 13, we don't have them. And so, Prop 13 loomed heavy, in my mind as something that took away from my community, quite frankly. And Prop 15, which is on the ballot, is a way to really make sure that corporations pay their fair share. I don't believe, in going back and looking at a lot of the data, that people believed when they voted for Prop 13, that they were protecting grandma and making sure grandma could continue to stay in her house, not that they were protecting, Disneyland and Walt Disney and major corporate land barons from paying their fair share in terms of upkeep and of physical plant and roads and infrastructure investments that are very costly and aren't done frequently. So Prop 15, I think, is something people should take a look at. Most selfishly, as a member of the Legislative Black Caucus, there are two initiatives that we are responsible for helping get to the ballot. Prop 16, which really is about equal opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to revisit Prop 209 of 24 years ago, to make sure that we are creating an opportunity and space for students of color and women to have access to publicly funded higher education in our state, and contracting for government contracts. The third, very quickly, I'll say, is Prop 17. It's not getting a lot of attention, but in the criminal justice reform space, and as we've spent a lot of time in this country talking about voter suppression, making sure that everyone who's already paid their debt to society continues to have the opportunity to weigh in on who represents them when they've returned home, they're working and they're paying taxes. So Prop 17 allows parolees, those who have returned home and have finished their parole, access to vote, to elect their representatives. Speaking of which, we've been joined by one.
All right, Khanna, welcome.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good. Looks like
Great to be here with Holly.
Yeah, terrific. So how'd the vote go?
Well, we haven't had it yet. It's been negotiations on figuring out whether we're going to have the stimulus. So a lot of conference calls and seeing what will happen and if it'll happen before the election.
Great. Well, I appreciate you just stepping out into the sunlight, literally, and joining us.
Of course.
Just to welcome you, I want to introduce that Khanna. We're honored to have him with us. He was elected to Congress in 2016, and he previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration. He's taught economics at Stanford, and he was co-chair of Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign, and he represents Silicon Valley in Congress. So I want to start with a question for you, Ro, that has come up. So it's something you authored in the past few days, in fact. We're talking about innovation in policy and how that comes to be. So you proposed term limits for the Supreme Court justices. You've written legislation on that. Tell us a little bit about sort of what do you think what's the problem that's being solved? And of all the solutions that are out there, why did you settle on term limits to sort of put your name under?
I know it's a great question. And I think Vice President Biden is very thoughtful in calling for a commission to look at all the different proposals. I think that that's going to be critical in the reform, especially as Amy Coney Barrett marches forward in an illegitimate way. The term limits, though, I talked to a lot of law professors, and looked at the intent of the framers. And the intent of the framers, when they had Supreme Court or judges for life, was that you would serve on the Supreme Court sort of as a capstone to your career. They anticipated people at the end of their legal careers wanting to be on the court to sort of give back to the nation. They never anticipated the gamesmanship of getting people at a young age to serve for 30 to 40 years, where you basically are being governed by a previous generation. I mean, you have a previous generation making rules for the current generation. And this is totally antithetical to what our framers wanted. Now, what I didn't understand until I talked to a lot of the constitutional scholars is that the Constitution says that someone needs to be a judge for life. It doesn't say that someone needs to be on the Supreme Court for life. So if you craft something that says you have 18 years on the Supreme Court, and then you let them serve on a circuit court or a district court or take senior status without hearing, without actively deciding and hearing cases, you could actually give them tenure for life, but still have rotation on the Supreme Court. So no one is on there for more than 18 years. It turns out this idea is very popular, even among Republicans, when you poll it. And I think it would go a long way to reforming the court.
Fantastic. So the originalists have something to chew on there.
Yeah, exactly.
About, what the constitutional intent was. Great. Hey, a few questions have come up in our chat here about techlash, and you're the congressman from Silicon Valley, but you're also known for talking about how big tech has too much power. So walk us through your analysis on that, and how you approach that.
Well, the first thing I think we need is an Internet Bill of Rights that Speaker Pelosi had asked me to come up with almost 3 years ago after the Cambridge Analytica scandal that I worked on with Tim Berners-Lee, who was the founder of the World Wide Web. And the core idea of the Internet Bill of Rights, there are 10 provisions, but the core idea is that our data should not be used without our consent. Let me give you one just a basic example. On the QAnon and the massive spread of that conspiracy, 64% of people who joined QAnon groups or extremist groups like that, according to some of the studies, had active recommendations by Facebook or Twitter to join those groups. So this is not saying, oh, don't censor speech, allow Donald Trump to say QAnon is great. That's not what Facebook did. It's not just that they said, okay, we're for free speech and we're not going to take down Donald Trump's post. They actually looked at people's data, looked at what people would be most susceptible, and actively promoted data recommendations to them, say, join this group. So if we give people much more autonomy and consent over the use of their data, and if we force these sites to disclose more about their algorithms and what they're pushing, then we can minimize their power of manipulation. And there's more we need to do. There's a second area, I think, is antitrust, where I think these platforms shouldn't be able to abuse their dominance and should have a duty to deal fairly. What does this mean? If they've created a platform, they should allow other companies' apps to be able to sell on there. They shouldn't be able to discriminate against certain sellers or charge them large fees. So, those are just a couple ideas, but I think there are ways that we can have thoughtful regulation that still allows for innovation, but democratizes some of these platforms.
So are you, does that mean you're in favor of more regulation, but not breaking up Facebook? Or how do you think about that?
Well, I don't think that I certainly am in favor of more regulation. I don't think that the original merger should have been approved. I don't think that there's any rationale for Facebook to acquire Instagram or WhatsApp. There have been 700 or so acquisitions of the big tech companies over the last 30 years. Take a guess how many times the DOJ or FTC has, of those 700 mergers and acquisitions, said disapproved of an acquisition. Any guess?
I'm going to say
one.
Okay.
One time. So, people say, well, aren't you going to squelch innovation? Yeah, you don't. You want to have them acquiring companies that are 50 million, 100 million, because those are exit strategies. And yeah, you're for that. But $1 billion acquisition of Instagram, 19 billion of WhatsApp, these should never have been approved. Now, so I think we need a much better standard in terms of not approving these things in the future. In terms of unwinding it, I think it has to be a a fact-based inquiry and should be looked into. I mean, the concern will be you don't want data in 3 different places, and can you get consumer consent? And a lot of the teams have been intermingled, and a lot of the features have been intermingled. So it's always harder to unwind something. But I'd be open to looking at that, or I think the FTC and others should look at whether it can be unwound. But certainly going forward, there needs to be a much stricter standard in terms of not allowing these big mergers that lessen competition.
Got it. Well, look,
you know, what's
ahead,
troubling
Holly.
about that, if I could just add on,
Please.
is that, you know, sometimes government doesn't get it the first time. That's the same mistake I think we made in public utilities with telephone, landlines versus mobile, where we allowed these acquisitions. And as I said before you got on, Congressman, I think, you know, government is often slow and behind the 8 ball, and we don't keep up with innovation. And then when it comes to try to unwind those things, it becomes next to impossible. Because
No, I
then
completely,
public will, because then lobbying gets involved, and public will won't let us.
yeah, I completely agree with that. And my instinct is probably you should unwind it, but it's not as simple as when people say, okay, just break it up. Well, what if you're a user on Facebook and Instagram and they broke it up and Apple acquires Instagram or some other company acquires Instagram, and as you're a user now that your data is not just with Facebook and Instagram, but a third party. So if we are going to now unwind it, there are going to have to be questions of what happens to people's data and privacy and what happens to features. So, Holly, I completely agree with you. It should never have been approved in the first place. When the government misses the moment, it creates huge complications that aren't easy to resolve.
So let's talk about another moment that, you know, I think intersects your 2 districts and your 2 interests. So LA remains a manufacturing hub in our country. Perhaps diminished over recent years. And Ro, you've written a lot about manufacturing, and I think the question really is for the audience here. You know, when we're in this digital global world where things move around so quickly, why should somebody who's building a startup in LA care whether the manufacturer is in LA or in Peoria, or, you know, rather not in Germany or China, which have very robust ecosystems? Tell us about your theory of manufacturing and why it's an important thing for this community.
Well, first of all, it creates good paying jobs, which have a multiplier effect. And so we can't have such a consumer culture that we forget that we actually have to have people who are employed and making a good wage, and that's part of dignity in a society. And so why would any country not want to compete for some of the best paying jobs? The second thing is we've seen, obviously, with the COVID example, that countries need basic critical supplies, and they need a critical production capacity in times of crisis. Hopefully, we never have a situation of war, but you saw in a pandemic. I mean, we didn't have it's one thing to say, okay, we can't, or let me put it differently. How is it that our country is so capable, I mean, bluntly capable, in terms of getting close to a vaccine? And I'm not talking about how Trump has politicized it, but these companies, I mean, it's fairly amazing that whether it's within a year, you may be able to get a vaccine, and yet we can't produce masks, and we couldn't produce enough ventilators. I mean, obviously we have incredible brilliance in terms of innovation, yet just massive underinvestment in certain basic production and critical supplies. So we should have that productive capability in the future. And then the final point is you can't separate innovation from production. There's a reason Apple still does all the prototype manufacturing in Cupertino and in the United States. You need some basic production to be able to do innovation. And so you couldn't ever have a purely design-based economy.
Got it. Well, look, I want to switch now. Holly and I were talking earlier about sort of the use of technology in sort of the business of politics and sort of your day-to-day. Obviously, Zoom is the #1 most used technology these days. But what do you think, if you reflect on your time from the Obama administration to now, Ro, what's been the most disruptive technology in terms of how you conduct your engagement as a political representative?
I would say social media by far, and I think one of the problems is that Facebook is totally dominated by conservative groups. If you look at the top 10 Facebook sites pages, 9 of them are conservative. The only folks who are who have penetrated or progressive are Occupy Democrats, and they do a brilliant job. They actually have twice the following and engagement as Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump has, like 10 times the engagement of even Bernie Sanders, or who's next, and then Joe Biden is, behind. But we have not done as good a job on these platforms. Now, partly it's because the conservatives have a message that is easy to spread. When you appeal to negative sentiment, that can go viral, and it's more divisive. But figuring out how we manage these platforms for our causes, I think, is really important. And these platforms are mixed, right? I mean, yes, they have QAnon, and they have extremist groups, and they have hate groups, but they've also allowed for Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements and Sunrise movements. So what we need to figure out is, how do we use these social media sites to amplify the good of organizing and not the bad?
Any ideas on that either of you would like to see promoted, on how to amplify good versus bad?
Well, I could, and then I'd love Holly's thoughts. I mean, I think there's both the regulatory and and then just the practical. I think on the regulatory side, like I said, we need far more disclosure about these groups' algorithms. There needs to be much more stakeholder involvement. I think there are a lot of posts that actually do qualify as an imminent threat to violence, even under the First Amendment, that should be pulled down, that don't get pulled down. I think if there's a court order that says that something's an imminent threat to violence, the platform should have to pull it down and shouldn't have immunity from liability if a court finds that. I think we need more campaigns on digital literacy. And I think we need to have crowdsourcing of news items. One interesting study at Stanford showed that when you have people who are very conservative and very liberal, and if you crowdsource news sources and you get people's opinion, they actually converge on what the credible sources are versus not the credible sources. So giving consumers sort of that power to have crowdsourced information as opposed to just kind of the Wild West, I think would help. In terms of our practical strategies, I just think we need to, the mistake that the Democrats make, and I say this representing Silicon Valley, is they think that the best way to have a smart digital strategy is to go talk to Eric Schmidt or Sheryl Sandberg or Tim Cook. That would be like if I wanted to have a great television show or movie, and I talked to the people who invented the television set or who invented film. No, that's a totally different skill. Just because they understand technology doesn't mean they understand art or what goes viral or content creation. And I think the Democrats have to pay a lot. We need to hire the 20, 30-year-olds who really understand how to make catchy, exciting content that can go viral.
Well, that's a great transition to a question for both of you about amplifying the good. I can see a lot of claps and people saying they agree with that sentiment. How can this group, we've got a lot of digital creatives on this call, and people who are running small businesses that are digitally savvy. What's the best way for them to get involved, either between now and 11 days from now when the election's over, but more importantly beyond that? What do you both think, Holly and Ro? What would be your call to action for this audience? Holly, you want to start with that?
And if I could just add on to kind of an answer to your previous question, I think we also have to be clear about the demographics of who Democratic voters are, and it still continues to be an older population. And how do we continue to inform them? We know that they're going to be the ones to get out and vote still, but how do we pull them into and create a sense of comfort and a sense of expectation? You know, in campaigns, we still are spending an inordinate sum of money on mail and commercials, print, social media, paid media. And so how do we begin to meet the need of that demographic in a different, more cost-efficient way where we can use innovation and social media? I think that's something we have to figure out. I don't know that I have the answer, but I think we have to figure it out.
And what about for this audience? How do we get these folks who are on this call and who are very interested? Because they're sticking with us for 45 minutes. What's your call to action for them?
I think that's a great point. And as the congressman said, you know, the powers that be have to recognize that we need them, that they actually have the vision and the idea and the innovation, that we have to go and get them. You know, I don't know that I have an answer, because I don't know, quite frankly, if the powers that be within our party are ready. I don't know if the congressman has a different idea.
So should they reach out to you, Holly, if somebody wants to make an impact on LA?
You should certainly reach out to me in terms of, you know, our individual campaigns, and I would certainly then expose them and introduce them to people, and introduce them to folks who are organizing at the community level to frame content and to force us to think differently about campaigns and candidates, and to really compete with kind of the old school funders and the old school way of running campaigns. So absolutely reach out to me. I was thinking institutional as we were talking about the Democratic Party.
Sure.
So, but absolutely reach out to me if I'm successful in this race.
The top is harder to change than the bottom. So,
and I think the top would then pay attention when they see candidates who run successful races differently change and tap into these creatives. Then I think the top would pay attention at a different level.
Yeah. Well, Ro, over to you. What would be your call to action to this audience in terms of how to get engaged?
Well, I would just say that I think the place they can be the most engaged is helping us create good content and viral content. And if they have ideas on how to present that in ways that are compelling. I mean, right now until the election, they can just do it on their own, because it's going to be hard to get that up through a bureaucracy and have people run with it. But you know, one of the challenges I think we have in our party is we're too much based on committee, and we're not fast enough. I'll give you an example. I think Joe Biden won the debate last night. I think it was closer than the first debate, but he won. But within half an hour of that debate, Donald Trump had a video up of Joe Biden's previous statements on fracking, and every channel was pushing that on social media, and they're trying to show that you know, Biden is flip-flopping, which he's not, but they're so aggressive in the creation of that content. My guess is there's probably like 15 layers of approval process before we're out there in putting our stuff out, and that's just not how social media works. I think we have to be more quick to create content, quick to get people distributing that content, have content that is catchy, and so I think we're at a I believe we're going to win the campaign, but I think we're still at a structural disadvantage in terms of understanding how really social media works. And though Trump has been a horrible leader and uses it in abusive ways, I think it's worth studying some of the things they did just so that we don't get outmaneuvered on social media.
And I would just add, Chris, you know, yes, we've got 11 days to go, so I wouldn't focus on this election. But, you know, we are now, particularly here in California, in a constant election cycle. Members of Congress run every 2 years. Our margins of majority are so thin that there are battle districts all the time. And so as soon as we get past November 3rd, the effort will kick in to protect those very seats 2 years from now. So we're in a constant kind of election cycle, which can be exhausting. And so even if they can't penetrate by November 3rd, they can queue up to be ready for 2 years from now.
Fantastic. I want to, we're getting towards the end of things. For the audience, I think Digital Media Wire is going to drop in a couple of links to each of your sites and campaigns so people can get connected either by making a donation or just offering their name, and so that there's a way for you guys to continue this conversation after this. But maybe just quickly, since we only have a little bit of time, what's one thing that COVID has taught you that was, you know, just real quick, maybe start with Holly. There's, you know, a lot's happened. What's one thing it's taught you that you think will persist?
I had the pleasure of having a online, actually, Facebook Live conversation with our controller, Betty Yee, last Sunday, who talked about the silver lining in the cloud that she sees, that this is going to create an opportunity for us to do better and shape government differently. COVID pulled the blinders off for many, to have a deeper understanding of how many people in my district live and try to survive. And so when we have conversations now about equity, it's clear that it's not that racial equity is important, but we're talking about economic equity, housing equity, health equity, education equity. And so I am looking now at this as an opportunity to build different coalitions, and it's given me the opportunity to dream again, to vision what kind of LA County I want to take part in building.
Fantastic. Ro?
I think Holly was very eloquent, and I definitely agree with her in terms of showing the vulnerabilities that still existed. I'll take a different text that she spoke so eloquently on that. One thing I think we need to work on is the complete lack of trust that exists in our society with institutions and each other. And by this, I mean, look, Apple and Google created a contact tracing app, and there are a lot of things Apple and Google have done wrong that I've criticized them for. But in this app, it actually turns out that they followed a lot of the rules. It requires data consent, it data minimizes. It's a pretty good app. And the adoption rate in Ireland was about 35%, in Germany about 20%. We don't have a national strategy. We only have 10 states that are doing it. And it's a very minimal percentage, a few percent of Americans that are using it, which is partly, I think, because we're so skeptical of each other and we don't have a sense of community. And if people aren't willing to wear a mask, they're probably not willing to do an app. So I think that there is a real conversation in this country that needs to be had about what our sense of community is and common purpose is, and how we have any common purpose in a future crisis.
Fantastic. Thank you both. There's so much more to do, and but really very stimulating to hear your different perspectives. So thank you so much. Ned,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, Ro, and Holly. We really appreciate your time today. I know that you must be as busy as ever right now. So thank you for sharing your time with us today. Folks, I just want to remind you, stay engaged. If you haven't voted, make your plans. We need everyone to be super alert and engaged these days as we head into the election. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.